Hey everyone, Ben Yunsen here. As you may be able to tell, the guitar sounds of Steely Dan have had a pretty huge impact not only on the way that I play, but also on the way that I approach music. Out of all the amazing guitar soloists who made the final cut of a Steely Dan record over the years, you can tell that Donald Fagen and Walter Becker paid incredible attention to detail in making sure that each soloist had impeccable tone, technical facility, and taste. No matter whether we're talking about Jeff Baxter, Denny Diaz, Elliott Randall, Dean Parks, Jay Graydon, and the list goes on. Now I know that many of you who enjoy watching my channel are also fans of Steely Dan, so if you have your own favorite solo, or solos plural, make sure to jump in the comments down below and let me know. I'd love to know what your favorites are. I'd like to start off with the brief but very beautiful solo played by guitar legend Hugh McCracken on Hey 19 from the album Gaucho, and you can hear it just before the 2-minute mark in the song. If you're unfamiliar with Hugh McCracken, he was one of the most prolific session guitarists in the history of recorded music. You'll see his name on albums by John Lennon, Art Garfunkel, Carly Simon. He also played on a lot of Tom Scott's albums in the mid to late 70s, and you'll hear him playing in tandem with the great Eric Gale on some of those albums. But going back to Hey 19, not only does it happen to be one of the funnier Steely Dan lyrics, it's also from my personal favorite Steely Dan album, Gaucho. It also happens to have these beautiful moments from Hugh McCracken where I sort of picked up a few guitar tricks of my own. For example, when you hear him come in with that beautiful phrase, it occurs over a C minor chord sound, and what it sounds like he's getting at there is a kind of a bluesy sound derived from probably the G minor pentatonic scale. And the G minor pentatonic scale over C minor, especially in this instance, is just a really beautiful sound. Next up we have Walter Becker's featured solo on Home at Last from Asia, which you can hear at about the 3.5-minute mark in the song. Now in my opinion, Walter Becker is an incredibly underrated guitarist. He does have a very different approach, especially by comparison with some of the more technically agile guitarists who you might have heard on a Steely Dan recording. But nonetheless, he really is one of my favorites, and I think he brought so much, especially to the album Asia, where you'll notice he's soloing on 4 of the tracks. He's the most prominent guitar soloist on the album Asia, which I find really interesting. On Home at Last, you can hear Walter paired with the great Larry Carlton, who holds down that fantastic rhythm guitar part that really drives the entire piece of music. A little bit like what we just discussed with the great Hugh McCracken, I picked up another interesting pentatonic scale concept from listening to Walter soloing on this song, and it's right at the beginning of his solo. You can hear Walter using a G minor pentatonic scale over an E flat major 7 chord, and it sounds a bit like this. And if you continue with the pentatonic scale like that, you can get even more out of it, a bit like this. And it works beautifully over the E flat major 7 sound. In fact, I discussed some of these pentatonic scale related concepts in my masterclass, How to Solo with the Pentatonic Scale, at bensguitarclub.com. But the way that I learned these types of concepts was originally from just listening to great guitar solos, and I really do think this is a classic and one of the best ever on a Steely Dan recording. By the way, if you've been enjoying this video, it would be great if you could give it a like so that we could push it out to as many people as possible, and consider subscribing so you don't miss any of my upcoming playing videos, lesson videos, or discussions about music a bit like this one. And if you'd like to learn guitar with me, make sure to join me at bensguitarclub.com. As I mentioned earlier, Gaucho is most certainly my favorite of all the Steely Dan albums. Which one's your favorite? Make sure to drop it in the comments down below. But out of all 7 tracks on Gaucho, my favorite has to be Glamour Profession, and that is in particular because of Steve Kahn's beautiful guitar solo occurring at about 5.5 minutes in. In fact, I loved Steve's solo on this so much, I actually spoke to him some years ago and asked him exactly what gear did you use on this track. He told me that he used a Gibson ES Artist guitar with active electronics, and he couldn't recall the exact amplifier, but he recalled it was most likely one of the Fender amps that was just at the studio. Incidentally, he also mentioned that he thought the guitar with active electronics had very little to do with the sound that actually ended up on the record, and thought that it really came down to his hands, and sold that guitar not long after Gaucho had been recorded, so there's an interesting bit of information for you as well. But the most important thing to me is that Steve's beautiful touch on the instrument is captured so perfectly on this track, and that guitar solo really makes the last, well, about 2 minutes of the song absolutely perfect. There's particularly a moment where Steve plays a sort of D Lydian mode type sound over a D major type chord, and it sounds something like this. And that's a real classic type of Steve Kahn idea from that era, in my opinion, especially if you've heard Steve's classic album Eyewitness. I couldn't make a list of Steely Dan guitar solos without mentioning the brilliant and underrated founding member of the band, Denny Diaz, who happens to play so many wonderful solos on numerous Steely Dan albums, but in particular, I'd like to talk about Your Gold Teeth 2 from the album Katie Lied. The most notable thing to me about this solo is that you can hear Denny's inimitable and immediately recognizable style in full force, and as a matter of fact, it doesn't matter if it's this song, or perhaps Denny's solo on Do It Again, or Your Gold Teeth from Countdown to Ecstasy, or Green Earrings, or any of the tracks he played on, you can tell it's him right away, and what an incredible quality that is. The only thing that I wish about Denny Diaz was that he had recorded more, maybe even some more under his own name. Denny's playing had such a profound impact on my own playing in its formative years, especially in terms of his picking style and the fact that he doesn't pick every note. Such an important influence for me. Last but certainly not least, after all this list is being presented in no particular order, I have to mention something from perhaps the most iconic of all the Steely Dan guitarists, and that is Larry Carlton. And while it was unquestionably the Royal Scam from 1976 that solidified Larry as an integral, if not immediately iconic part of the Steely Dan sound, it's actually his only solo from the album Gaucho that really caught my ear. And that solo was on a track called Third World Man, and you can hear this solo from about 4 minutes into the song. If you are at all familiar with the story of how Gaucho was recorded, particularly leading up to its eventual release in 1980, you'll know that there was originally supposed to be a song on the record called The Second Arrangement. Now, of course, this song was famously erased by accident and of course did not end up on the album. And with time constraints to get the record finished, Donald and Walter pulled up an unused track from several years before called Were You Blind That Day? The lyrics and the lead vocal were reworked, but the track itself remained mostly the same, and that track became Third World Man and happened to feature what I think is one of Larry Carlton's finest moments on record. As a matter of fact, it was a solo from which I learned some of my first bluesy sort of singing ideas on the guitar, and who better to learn these types of ideas from than Larry himself. And even though the second arrangement may not have made the final cut of Gaucho, I'm really glad that this song and perhaps more importantly, this solo did. And there we have it. Those are my 5 favorite Steely Dan guitar solos. Which ones did you like? Maybe you love all 5 that I chose. Maybe there's another set of guitar solos that you love that I didn't even mention. Make sure to drop a comment and let me know. And while you're at it, make sure to give this video a like so that we can push it out to as many people as possible. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.